Today's message is based on the story from the 4th chapter of John's Gospel, where Jesus meets the Samaritan woman at the well. If you'd like to read the story before listening to the sermon, again, it's John chapter 4, beginning at verse 5. Sometimes we take the simplest things for granted. Take the bucket, for instance, one of the best inventions ever when you stop and think about it. I have a bucket at home that I use all the time, and I'll bet you do too. I use mine for washing the car, for catching water when the sink leaks. I use it to carry tools, to haul dirt. I use it to cover things and store things. I've even used it in a children's message a time or two, and now I'm using it in a sermon. The bucket has been around for a very long time. The earliest known reference to a bucket was some 3,200 years before Jesus, when something called the Narmer pallet portrayed one of Pharaoh's servants carrying a bucket. 3,000 years later, buckets had become far more sophisticated. They were painted terracotta. Some had silver handles. Museums have some that appear as if they were used to serve fine wine, and some supposedly were even used to bring wine to Jesus and his disciples. It wasn't actually called a bucket until around 1,000 years ago, when somebody with a vivid imagination thought it looked like a bulging belly, and that's exactly what the word bucket means. And that's appropriate because some of the earliest buckets were made from the internal organs of animals, which I'm sure did bulge when they were used to scoop up water. So now here we are centuries later. Buckets are still an important part of human life, from the earliest days when a child plays with a bucket and a shovel in a sandbox, to our last days when we euphemistically say somebody kicked the bucket. What an odd saying, huh? To kick the bucket. It came from an old Catholic custom that involved putting a bucket filled with holy water at the foot of the bed of a person who was dying. As friends and relatives came to visit, they would dip their fingers in the water and sprinkle it on that person. Just before the person died, his or her legs would often twitch and, you guessed it, kick the bucket. And it's said that's where the expression came from. Then again, maybe it came from the name of the wooden beam that a pig was carried on upside down by those who were about to slaughter it. That beam was called a bucket. As the pig was suspended upside down as it tried to get away, its feet kicked the bucket. Regardless of where the phrase came from, one thing's for sure: to kick the bucket is a bizarre and not all that respectful way of describing death, and yet it's a phrase many of us use to this day. Buckets have come a long way since those early bulging bellies. Eventually they were replaced by stone buckets, then by leather buckets, then by wooden buckets. In 1837, a man named Stanislaus Sorel patented the first galvanized metal bucket, which became the standard for 130 years until cheap, colorful plastic buckets came along in 1967. There are even glass buckets nowadays. My guess is there won't ever be a time when there won't be a need for buckets, or at least some kind of bucket. Of all things, today's gospel story has a bucket at the very center of it. In fact, it's one of the only two places in the Bible where the word bucket is used. The other is in the Old Testament, where the prophet Isaiah says that the greatest of nations are like a drop in a bucket to God. It's a rare word, to be sure, and to tell you the truth, I never paid much attention to it before, but for some reason when I read the story of Jesus at the well, this time the word bucket caught my attention. He had just entered Samaria with his disciples. While everyone else went off to buy food, Jesus stayed to rest by a well. A Samaritan woman came along. When he asked for a drink, it surprised and shocked her because she was a Samaritan, he was a Jew. And they weren't supposed to even speak to each other, let alone share a drink of water. She asked how it was that he even noticed her, and that's when he said something about living water, and if only she knew who he really was, she could have all the living water she wanted. Then she made this odd statement about a bucket. "Sir, you have no bucket, and the well is deep. Where are you going to get this water?" Now wait a minute. Wasn't she there to draw water from the well herself? Wouldn't she have had a bucket that she could have loaned to him? And then again, Well, maybe it was improper to loan a stranger your bucket. Maybe she was being facetious or sarcastic. If you somehow have living water, sir, then shouldn't you also have a special bucket to get this living water? Now remember, they're not even supposed to be talking to each other, although she has clearly made enough mistakes in her life that breaking this particular taboo wouldn't make that much difference. She's simply reacting like any suspicious, skeptical person might react. A stranger tells her about some mystical living water that gushes out of the ground, but he doesn't even have so much as a thimble to collect it with, and she's supposed to believe it? Then again, what if it's true? She had made an absolute mess of her life. If she could somehow get her hands on this living water, don't you think she would jump at the chance? What about you? Have you ever been in that place? Facing a situation that's so difficult, so distressing, so devastating, so frightening, so impossible that it felt like there's no way out. You lose somebody you love and it's unbearable. Someone relentlessly criticizes you and says nothing you do is ever good enough. You're exhausted by your situation, wishing and praying for some of that living water, but it seems elusive at best, maybe even non-existent. Maybe you care about someone so much, but that person is being difficult. Maybe they're making poor choices and they just won't listen to your good reason. You try and try, but your most loving efforts don't seem to make a dent. You find out you've got an aggressive form of cancer or some other condition that feels so out of control. You wonder where and how you'll ever find the strength and courage and faith to deal with it. You've got a huge heart. You want to do something to make a difference for those who are suffering, for children who are being abused, for those who feel alone, for that homeless person who deserves better, for those who are going to be suffering from this coronavirus. But these things are so huge. How can you, one person, change anything? If only you could get a hold of some of that living water. 3 days ago, I received a note from a woman I taught in confirmation class some 25 years ago. After hearing nothing from her all these years, out of nowhere she wrote this: "Pastor Steve, I am writing to you because I want to know what I should do with my life." So here she is, a 40-year-old woman, having this crisis. She continues, "Lately, I've been struggling with what I thought was God's plan for my life. I've gotten to do some amazing things the last few years, but now I'm restless. I'm questioning every decision I ever made. I'm not really sure what I'm asking, but I just thought maybe you would have a piece of wisdom to share." Sounds to me like she's craving some of that living water that Jesus promises, but she can't seem to find her own bucket. "If only you knew who it was that's talking to you," Jesus said to the woman at the well, "you would have asked, and he would have given you this living water." Ask, Jesus says, if only you would ask. But sometimes it's hard to see him standing next to you, with you, in those times that are most difficult. We tend to see the obvious, but we have trouble seeing the possibilities beyond the obvious. Take death, for example. Death appears to be the absolute end. We forget that where God is concerned, death is simply an opportunity to make something new and wonderful happen. Nicodemus had that problem in last week's gospel when Jesus talked to him about being born again. Nicodemus said incredulously, "What? Can a person enter back into a mother's womb and be born a second time?" He couldn't see that the one standing right there in front of him was the very Son of God who had the power to change everything about his life. In another story in the same part of John's Gospel, a man who was paralyzed for 38 years was sitting beside a pool at Bethesda when Jesus came and stood next to him. The man looked up and said, "I have no one to put me in the pool." Really? He said those words as Jesus was standing right there to help him? How easy it is to lose sight of the promise that Jesus is with you all the time, that he will be your help and strength in every circumstance, and that nothing is impossible for God. The story of the Samaritan woman at the well reads like a soap opera, that's for sure. She is so deeply entangled in personal drama that any possibility of dignity and respect was lost long ago. The fact that she's coming to the well alone in the hottest part of the day says everything that needs to be said. Everyone else comes in the cool of the day, but she has to come when it's unbearably hot because she has no other choice. She's an outcast. She's been ostracized again and again because of her long track record of stupid choices and sketchy relationships. She has no friends, no family, no support system, no self-respect. She's burned every imaginable relationship and societal bridge. Social distancing, let's just say, was not a challenge for her. But you see, that's what makes this story so perfect. The very point of it is that she is the lowest of the low, and yet Jesus speaks to her. He offers her living water. He forgives her past mistakes. He provides a new start for her. He restores her dignity and worth and gives her a future. And if he can do that for her, is there anyone he can't do it for? The language she spoke was Aramaic. The Aramaic word for husband is Baal. Recognize that word? You've seen it in the Old Testament. Baal was one of the greatest of the false gods. Oh, sure, the ancient Israelites turned to the true God when it came to crises that were huge, but in normal, everyday things like crop growing and weather watching, they turned to Baal and other false gods. For that, they were constantly bombarded with words of criticism and condemnation from prophets like Jeremiah and Elijah and Hosea, among others. But understanding that word gives us a very interesting and insightful look at what was really going on in this conversation between her and Jesus at the well. In Aramaic, Jesus says to her, "Go call your Baal, and then come back." She answers, "I have no Baal." Jesus says, "You are right in saying, 'I have no Baal,' for you have had 5 Baals." That's when she has this light bulb moment. "Sir, I see that you are a prophet." You see, in some ways, this isn't a conversation about husbands and not husbands, but rather about gods, about who and what we put first in our lives. We all get distracted and fooled by false gods. The God of trying to be more than we are, the God of finding pleasure in the wrong people and things, the God of pursuits and longings that will never be truly satisfying, the God of claims and promises that are way too good to be true. You know what I'm talking about. We spend so much time and effort striving after those things only to end up exhausted and frustrated, down on ourselves, and wholly unsatisfied. The Sunday I retired, a woman came up to me and told me a story about a man who was obsessed with hunting. His wife kept begging him to come to church with her, but he always said the same thing. He said, "Honey, Sunday is my hunting day. You go to church, I'll go hunting." And that's what they did, week after week, year after year. She went to church, he went hunting. One Saturday, he went out to prepare for the next day's hunting trip. He drove to a certain area and he scouted it. He carefully set up a tree stand. He got everything prepared so the next day he could come back, climb the tree, and start hunting. Sunday morning, sure enough, he woke up early, drove to the location, walked to the tree, got ready to climb, when all of a sudden he heard a noise above him. When he looked up, he saw a big old bear sitting happily in his tree stand. He immediately raced back to his truck and texted his wife, "I will be joining you in church today." He got there just in time for the sermon, which, as it turns out, was titled, "God Works in Mysterious Ways." Standing here in Libby, Montana, far be it from me to say you shouldn't hunt on Sundays. I would not do that. What I am saying, though, is that maybe now is the time for all of us to consider the gods we're worshiping. Only one offers living water, the God of life and grace who knows you so well and loves you more than your greatest ability to imagine, despite whatever mistakes you've made in life. In your most challenging moments, Jesus stands next to you, close to you, within you, waiting to be recognized, eager to hear you ask, "Lord, give me this water that I may never be thirsty again." Just ask.